I remember the swish of big blue stem rolling above my head, the shush brush of Indian grass soft against my arms, the rattle of wild indigo in a dry September wind. Lived experience and ancestral memory blur in the hypnotic sway of grass. The ground rumbles with buffalo. Is this homesickness for what I left behind, or for what has left me? Hi everybody, it's Bridget from the Clifton Institute here. That was the beginning of an essay called Tall Grass by Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's a botanist and a writer. And she was writing about the tall grass prairies in Kansas. But here we are in our own prairie or grassland at Clifton. This is called Upper Woodcock. Maybe some of you have been here before. And the reason it's called Upper Woodcock, it's named after a bird called the American woodcock. And they use this field as a dance floor. And they will only dance in a field, they will not dance in a forest. This is one of the very special places you can come in February or March just as the sun is setting, and you can watch the male American woodcocks come and dance. And this is kind of what it looks like. They come out, they walk into their nice open dance floor. They give them each other space so they're not all crammed together. And he starts out by going, meep, meep, meep. And then he'll take off in these big circles, gets to the top of the big circle. You can barely see them now because it's kind of dark and they're really high up. And then they go, and it starts over again. And so that's part of the reason we keep this field like it is because we love seeing them dance. We love having a place, a habitat for them. And if you're watching this video, it's probably because you came out and helped us study either this field or one of our other fields here at Clifton. You might have been looking for the faces of some plants. You might have been looking, for example, for, maybe you recognize this one, a goldenrod, or a little blue stem. Maybe you were looking for Indian grass, the tall yellow grasses behind me that Dr. Kimmerer mentions in her story. Or maybe you were here catching insects, things that something like a woodcock might eat or another bird might eat. Maybe you caught a jumping spider that was catching insects, things like that. And you probably wrote those numbers down on a piece of paper because you were a good field scientist and you kept track of what you found. But now what we have to do is figure out what story those numbers tell. What did we learn about grasses and other plants here in our grasslands? How are our grasslands different from each other just here at Clifton? What about insects? Do we see different insects and other invertebrates in different fields? Was one field really spidery and one field really not spidery? I wonder why that would be. And usually, every time you answer a question, you have to ask about 10 more questions. So usually, you never just end there. There are more things to learn after you've figured out a part of your answer. And so what we're going to do now is take a look at what you guys discovered this year in our grasslands. So let's take a look, shall we? First off, we had a lot of people helping out this year. We had around 600 students from 10 schools cover 1,480 square meters of grassland looking for bugs and plants in 2024. And this wouldn't have happened without the help of our excellent education volunteers who take the day to come lend their knowledge and skills to help with field trips. So thank you all. And just a reminder why we're so into grasslands. Grasslands, especially native grasslands, can be super hotspots for biodiversity, but they are also disappearing fast. And that means that the plants and animals who can only survive in grasslands, like the American kestrel, are also disappearing. Here in Virginia, in order to keep a grassland from becoming a forest, you have to disturb it. And when people make those disturbances on purpose, you can call it managing. Managing basically means that you're discouraging woody trees and encouraging grasses and wildflowers. And there's lots of ways to do this. You can use cows or a mower or fire. Stuff that will hurt most woody plants, but not our native grasses and wildflowers. We're not really sure how the different kinds of disturbance, or when or how often you do them, affects plants and animals. Which leads us to our question, How does the way we manage our grasslands affect what plants and insects live there? This year, we studied 3 of Clifton's grasslands: the experimental grassland, Turkey Gap, and Upper Woodcock. The experimental grassland has been a grassland the longest, and it had cows on it up until about 6 years ago. Since then, it gets mowed or burned every single year, so we might call it heavily managed. Turkey Gap and Upper Woodcock probably had cows on them up until the 1970s or 80s, but then were left mostly alone up until 5 years ago. Since then, we mow or burn them less often, maybe every 2 or 3 years. So you might call them lightly managed. So the question is, how different are the plant and insect communities between the experimental grassland, Turkey Gap, and Upper Woodcock? So to figure that out, students had to learn between 5 and 15 species of plants that they could then pick out in a sea of other kinds of plants, which is no small feat, so you should be very proud. The species they were learning were grasses, wildflowers, or woody shrubby plants. And those aren't really families of plants, it's just a way to describe a plant's function in an ecosystem. Grasses make flowers too, but not showy ones like wildflowers might. Grasses like Indian grass and little bluestem might make nice hiding places for animals, and then the seeds are around in the winter for birds to eat. Wildflowers have flowers that produce nectar that lure in insects who use the nectar and pollen for food. Woody shrubby plants provide structure, like hiding places for things like box turtles and berries for animals to eat. However, too many woody shrubby plants and it becomes hard to mow or burn, which makes nice hiding places for baby trees, which then take root and start to grow a forest. And remember, once it's a forest, the grassland plants and animals won't be able to survive there anymore. Students worked in small teams to survey a 10-meter squared section, or chunk. They looked for the plant species in that chunk and put check marks next to the names of the species that they found. That's what got written down. So, to turn all of those hundreds of check marks into a picture, we can make a graph. This is a graph showing how often we found 6 of the plants in the 3 study fields. The 2 grasses, Indian grass and little bluestem, are in yellow. The 2 wildflowers, crownbeard and goldenrod, are in green, and the 2 woody shrubbies, blackberry and coralberry, are in purple. Since we looked at different numbers of chunks in each grassland, instead of comparing how many chunks we saw Indian grass in, we have to look at how many out of the total number of chunks did we see Indian grass in, which you can say is a percent. For example, we found Indian grass in about 40% of the experimental grassland chunks. It means that we found it in 4 out of every 10 chunks. So just take a minute, you can pause the video if you like, and ask, what do I notice in this graph? Okay, here's what I noticed. It seems like Turkey Gap and Upper Woodcock are similar. They both have almost every plant in almost every single chunk. On the other hand, the experimental grassland have the 2 grass species in only about half of the chunks, wildflowers in about 3/4 of the chunks, and then blackberry in about half the chunks. So I read this as Turkey Gap and Woodcock being homogeneous, meaning all the plants are everywhere equally. In the experimental grassland, on the other hand, there are patches of grasses, patches of wildflowers. They aren't sprinkled evenly across the hillside. I also noticed that all 3 fields had coralberry in 100% of the plots. And we can look at how the experimental grassland has changed between this year and last year. In this graph, the lighter bars are last year and the darker bars are this year. Again, yellows are grasses, greens are wildflowers, purples are woody shrubbies. So scanning this graph and looking for bars that are really different heights, carpet grass really jumps out to me. We found it in about 50% of the plots last year and only 10% of the plots this year, which is great news. Carpet grass is an invasive grass that seems to love fire, so maybe that invasive plant is going down. However, on the flip side, I also see that we found the invasive bush clover in more plots this year than last year. So did we just trade out one invasive species for another? And if I scan and I look for patterns, I also notice that most of the wildflowers, the green bars, have taller, dark bars than light bars, meaning they were found more frequently this year than last year, which is awesome. But I also notice in the yellow bars that Most of the light yellow bars are taller than the dark yellow bars, meaning that we found more grasses last year than this year. So is the grassland getting more wildflowery and less grassy? We'll just have to see if the trend continues, and I wonder what it will mean for the animals that use grasses and wildflowers. So to summarize, we did find that even though the experimental grassland has been managed more heavily and for longer as a grassland, it actually had fewer plots with our native grasses in it compared to the other fields who are not managed as heavily. Maybe the invasive fescue grass left in the experimental grassland from years of having cows on it is still too strong for the native grasses to take hold. We also found the turkey gap and woodcock had almost all of the species present throughout the whole field, so a very evenly mixed plant community. The grassland, on the other hand, seemed to have patches of grass and wildflowers. So I wonder if animals prefer patches of plants or an even mix of plants. And lastly, everywhere had coralberry. So I wonder what animals are using it and if we'll see lots more of them surviving and reproducing if this trend continues. Okay, so that was plants. Now let's move up the food chain to bugs. And we're going to count spiders and insects together as just bugs. So for these studies, we were comparing how many of each group of bugs did we find in each field. So we could say which field is the buggiest, but also which field had the most grasshoppers, or beetles, or spiders. We went out with bug jars or sweep nets and identified and counted as many bugs as we could in a certain number of minutes. So when we make a picture of the number of bugs we found in each field, again, we can't just look at the total number, since we counted for a different number of minutes in each field. We need to make a rate, just like we did for plants. So here on the vertical or y-axis is bugs per hour, or BPH. The taller the bar, the faster we were finding and catching bugs. So now think about the following questions. 1, which field had the highest rate of bugs, and which field had the lowest rate? And what are some things that you think could affect the rate of bugs, the rate at which they are being tallied? Okay, so it looks like in Upper Woodcock we were catching 300 bugs per hour compared to Turkey Gap where it was more like 100 bugs per hour. So what's up with that? Why would that be? Something that comes up during trips is that in areas with lots of blackberries or thorny plants, the sweep nets get stuck and it's harder to catch bugs. And if you go back to the slide comparing the 6 plants between the fields, you do see that Turkey Gap has blackberry in most of the chunks. However, there is blackberry in almost the same percentage of chunks in Woodcock. So I don't know about that theory. Another factor that may affect these numbers is that both Turkey Gap and Woodcock were only surveyed in the spring, whereas the experimental grassland was surveyed in the spring and late summer. So how do you think temperature and season might affect the number and kinds of bugs we find? Well, let's look at the breakdown by field. So each circle represents all of the bugs caught in each field. The differently colored pie pieces show out of the total bugs caught in a field, what percent of the total were beetles, what percent were moths and butterflies, and so on. For example, the red pie pieces represent the percent of bugs caught that were in the fly order, aka the Diptera. So it's about 20% in both the experimental grassland and woodcock, but they were 60% of the bugs we caught in Turkey Gap. That is so many flies. I wonder why Turkey Gap would have so many flies, and also way fewer ants, bees, and wasps than the other 2 fields. Are the flies out competing the bees? But if you take a step back and just look at the evenness of the pie slices, it looks like woodcock has the most evenly cut pie, meaning that there were similar numbers of each kind of bug. And if you remember, that was true for plants too. So even numbers of each bug and evenly spread plant species. Okay, so what story do the bugs tell? Similar to the plants, the bugs are telling us that Upper Woodcock is full of plants and animals and very evenly spread. They tell us that Turkey Gap might be a good place for flies, but not for ants, bees, and wasps. But we should also look at these numbers with just a little bit of doubt, since we didn't get very much bug data this year, mostly because of weather. So the fields weren't all sampled in the same seasons or ideal weather. So we definitely need more data. And as per usual, we now have a lot more questions than we started with. Like, if there's so much coralberry everywhere, are there animals using it for something? Who is eating it and using it for shelter? And are we going to see more of those animals in the future? Or will the experimental grasslands start to look more like Upper Woodcock or Turkey Gap if we start to only mow or burn it every other year instead of every single year? We've been talking about not burning it every year anymore, and I wonder if we do that, if the grassland will start to have a more even spread of plants, more like the other two fields. And we should be able to see that if we keep doing plant surveys. Lastly, I wonder about methods. How much does when and how we survey affect the story that the fields tell? Like, maybe if we looked at how much of each plant is in each chunk instead of just whether or not we see it, it would change how grassy we really think the grassland is. Or maybe if we sampled the bugs in all the fields on the very same day, we would see different results. But for now, we're just going to keep the same methods so that we can compare data from year to year. And there are lots of other studies being done by students and scientists looking at grassland plants and animals in this part of Virginia. And hopefully, when we put all of our data together, we can really understand how different management affects grasslands. And that will help us make choices to make the best possible habitat for the most possible plants and animals.
All right, so we've learned about our plants, we've learned about our insects, we've answered some questions, and now we have a whole bunch more questions that we'd love to answer. And part of taking care of a piece of land and getting to know a piece of land is you have to go back again and again. Habitats change over time, just like people change over time. And it doesn't have to be this piece of land. I hope you come back here, but you can do it at a grassland near you. For example, you probably have a grassland either at home or near your school or by your library or community center called a lawn. And you can go out and do it a lawn exactly what you did here. What kinds of plants live there? What kinds of insects live there? What spiders live there? And year after year, go back. Are the same things living there? Do they show up in the same place? You can keep track of things like this, and you'll notice if there are changes. You'll see them happen. And you have the power to affect what plants and animals live near you. Do you want to see change? You can do things to your grassland. You can ask your teachers or your principals to do an experiment out there. We're actually doing that in Fauquier County called Lawn Lab with Grace Miller Elementary School and Liberty High School. And so I'm going to leave you with the last paragraph of Robin Wall Kimmerer's essay called Tall Grass, where she talks about the relationship between people and grasslands, which has been going on for a very long time. All over the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic, there is a movement spreading like wildfire. At first, it was purely local driven by the grassroots efforts of seed savers who sowed their precious handfuls in schoolyards or backyards. Today, there is a wave of prairie restorations large and small, from unmown yards to national wildlife refuges. After having tried to obliterate them, now we find we want prairies back. Storers of carbon, builders of soil, refuge of pollinators. It's not enough to just remember. We have to re-remember. Reclaim the lost members of the family of life. Acre by acre, the prairies were broke, and acre by acre, we will mend them. All right, y'all. Thanks for all your hard work this year. Have a great 2025, and I hope we'll see you soon.